Good morning. Recognizing a quorum, I am reconvening this meeting of the Cannabis Control Commission at 9:02 a.m. on today's October 9th. Is that right? Yeah, October 9th. Thank you. Can I ask? Can everybody in the back hear me? Thanks. Can I ask this meeting being recorded? Let me put the public on notice. This meeting is being recorded. Thank you. Please put your cell phones on mute or shut them off. Thank you. So just a couple comments. We're picking up on the agenda where we left off last Thursday. So we got all the way through item 5 and actually voted on final and provisional licenses. So we have 3 items on the agenda. We're just going to cover 2 of them today. The municipal survey, we're going to postpone the discussion on that until our next meeting, which is the 18th. We continue to get additional data from cities and towns, and we just thought it made sense to accumulate and analyze that data before we came up with an incomplete answer. So we're going to put that on the agenda for the 18th. So that leaves really 2 items for the agenda. The first is a discussion of social consumption, and I'll get into how I want to conduct that conversation. The second is a discussion and vote on headquarters and satellite office space for the commission. I do want to alert the audience that we will go into executive session for the discussion on our office locations, and we will adjourn from that executive session. So we'll, when we get to that, I'll give up the rationale for going into executive session on that topic. So we're going to have really only one topic for the public part of our meeting today, and that's social consumption. Just to put some context around this, when we voted on our final regulations in March of this year, we decided to defer action on allowing or not allowing social consumption. We said we wanted to ask the staff to do some research about other states and other topics relating to social consumption. We committed to get back to that discussion in October, so we will do so today. Sean will, the executive director, will present at a high level the results of the work that the staff has done on social consumption. My hope is that from the commission's perspective, we ask questions. If there are data or other pieces of information that we'd still like to see before we're comfortable discussing and voting on it, I'd like to get those raised, be very explicit about what we're looking for so we can give the staff direction on that. If we're comfortable we have all the information we need, we can certainly discuss and vote on it. But I want to make sure that before we get into the discussion that we have all the data that we need, and if we don't, that we're very explicit with the staff about what information we need. And I want to put a timeline on both asking the staff to provide that information as well as for our next conversation on the topic. So with that as an introduction, Mr. Executive Director, if you would provide an overview of the staff's work on social consumption.
Sure, good morning, and thank you, Mr. Chairman. So based on the Commission's request, the staff convened as a group and tried to pull together from various different aspects of functions in the Commission. So it involves legal, research from other states, including government affairs, as well as kind of a robust research approach. So I'm very proud of the fact that the team kind of came together and compiled information that is before you for your consideration, which will hopefully serve as a good guidepost for a lot of your discussions around this topic in particular. But and I'll go through kind of the high-level aspects of that memo, and then happy to take any questions or try to answer any questions that you may have, and of course it might require additional information or research on that.
Can I just, there's one more thing I wanted to say, sorry for the interruption, one more thing I wanted to say in the introduction. I just wanted to remind everybody that we asked the staff to go and look at specific topics and bring us back information and analysis. We did not explicitly ask the staff for recommendations, so the executive director's presentation will not include a recommendation. It will just include the data that we asked for.
Mr. Chairman, I asked for recommendations if they would like to provide them.
Oh. I think
they're not in the report, but I...
Okay, it's their discretion. We did not require that. Mr. Executive Director.
Sure. So as I indicated, this is a compilation of a lot of the efforts of staff at the Commission to build a review and some research as far as the issue of social consumption. And I'll give you certainly the high level, and again, I'm happy to take any questions or attempt to answer any questions you may have. I guess I'll preface it by saying that some may require additional research, which is obviously
Sure.
The guidance that we'd be seeking from the commission as far as any depth that you might seek. So, but as a jumping off point, as a practical matter, social consumption across the country is limited to municipalities, and there is no statewide jurisdiction, or I should say, no statewide licensing mechanism across the country, similar to Massachusetts as far as our ability here. There's some examples across the country, including the Alaska Alcohol and Marijuana Control Board. They have draft regulations out today. They have a public comment period that is open until November of 2018, but they're still in their development as far as regulations, which may be promulgated as soon as 2019. Maine had a consideration of social consumption. Their legalization panel did vote to delay that implementation until at least 2023.
2023?
2023, that's correct. We, of course, as you will recall, have a statutory authority to license the consumption of marijuana or marijuana products on the premises where sold. But as you indicated, Mr. Chairman, that during the final regulatory promulgation process, this discussion was delayed until now, and then any consideration as far as final regulations would be in the time frame of about a February time frame. So we do have that statutory authorization as far as licensing social consumption. Again, the intent of this memo is to really offer an overview of the research on social consumption, which will follow by some common policy issues that staff during the course of their review discovered, uncovered, and also just saw certain trends that they wanted to call the Commission's attention to. Because social consumption is not widely permitted, there is not a lot of research on the specific issue of social consumption of cannabis or cannabis products, but there's a lot of analogies drawn between alcohol and tobacco. Of course, it's not a perfect analogy, but there's some similarities that at least are worthy of the Commission's consideration. Those include, and this is from a report by the University of California, San Francisco's Center for Tobacco Control Research and Education, which those issues include exposure and ventilation of cannabis smoke and or vapor, impaired driving, server and retailer training and liability, the density of outlets, and lastly, the site's proximity to sensitive locations, and for example, that would include schools and churches. Regarding tobacco, the report states there is no risk-free level of tobacco smoke exposure in an enclosed area. That exposure cannot be eliminated by simply separating smokers and non-smokers, cleaning the air, or ventilating buildings. And this would be a good point to acknowledge that the smoking working group of the Commission is coming together. There's an expectation or a hope that their first meeting can convene in November, early November. We're just kind of searching for dates that fit everybody's schedule. Right. My expectation is that this group will work very expeditiously, really with advising the Commission as far as our additional research that may be necessary in pulling that together, hopefully by the end of the calendar year, but ideally want to give them as much time as they may need, but with a sense of urgency combined with that as well.
Appreciate that.
So again, there's really a lack of empirical data from the U.S. That said, there are other jurisdictions that do include some permission of social consumption. That, of course, is the Netherlands, and most commonly referred to as Amsterdam as well, as far as their experience, but broadly in the Netherlands. It's a country that has a quasi-cannabis legalization. Of course, it permits social consumption of cannabis sites, often referred to as cafes or their coffee shops. This was in place prior to the 2012 legalization in Colorado and Washington as well. Unlike U.S. dispensaries, though, which permit the sale of cannabis products for adults aged 21 and over, in some Netherlands cafes, small quantities of cannabis can both be bought and consumed for adults aged 18 and older. In 2006, it was projected that there were 700 operational cafes in the Netherlands, or one for every 29,000 citizens. And for Amsterdam in particular, there's one per 3,000. That is a good example of some insight that potential outcomes that we would explore as we move forward potentially with a similar licensing structure. However, the results need to be understood as far as context, that some cafes service both dispensaries or retail locations as well as social consumption sites. So some of the key findings, though, were that from the Netherlands, are that despite wide access to cafes, the prevalence of cannabis use remains on par with the European average. Cafes do not appear to encourage escalation into heavier use or lengthier use or drug use careers. The failure to regulate the supply to cafes and cannabis cultivation is the source of many of the current negative side effects of the Netherlands cannabis policy. And for research on cafes reflecting the outcomes of dispensary operations versus social consumption, more than 70% of cannabis is bought in licensed cafes. There were three variables that significantly and independently associated with buying from unlicensed suppliers. That's the density of the cafe, the age, or the sex of the buyer. Underage buyers are more than twice as likely to buy their cannabis from unlicensed dealers, and males were more likely to buy their cannabis from unlicensed sellers than females. So again, there's a real smattering of information relative to the Netherlands that's been supplied, and those footnotes are certainly available for your review as well. But those were some of the kind of high-level findings from the Netherlands. As far as the policy issues associated with social consumption, there's a few items that we certainly want to draw your attention to. As I indicated at the outset, there's no state that has a statewide licensing process for social consumption. To the extent that social consumption is limited nationwide, a decision from this commission to implement it would certainly be of note for other jurisdictions as well. But some of those states do have it, as indicated at the outset, as well in certain municipalities. So, and that is certainly the most ripe information and relevant information for our consideration today. The city of Denver does authorize the social consumption as a concept. However, the sale cannot take place within the licensed premises or anywhere outside of a licensed storefront. So there's a marijuana retailer that would certainly sell products, but patrons of a social consumption facility must bring their own marijuana and consume it in designated consumption areas. There's currently a task force that's been compiled or convened in Denver to look at this, and they noted an early finding was that some of the adverse effects of the limited opportunities for business to earn revenue, and they may seek a change at the state level, but that's really early information.
You use the word concept when you're talking about Denver, so there are no licenses that have been issued yet, is that correct?
The city of Denver has issued a license for the facility, but it's not a licensed marijuana establishment in the context of the Marijuana Enforcement Division. So it's
and that is licensed by their version of the Cannabis Control Commission, or is that licensed separately?
It's by the city.
By the city.
Yep.
Thank you.
The city of Las Vegas has a pending ordinance at the Las Vegas City Council that would permit a hookah-style lounge where adults may consume legal quantities of marijuana. They would operate next to legal dispensaries, but would not also be licensed by the state. They would be permitted to sell marijuana paraphernalia, but could not sell marijuana. This is a proposed ordinance. Interestingly enough, this proposed ordinance also allows social consumption businesses to sell beer and wine containing less than 11% alcohol content. The state of California is the only state allowing dispensaries to attach the equivalent of a tasting room. The number of these lounges are limited, of course, as local governments must approve the on-site consumption, and to date, San Francisco, Oakland, and South Lake Tahoe have licensed tasting rooms attached to dispensaries. There's one example that's been drawn out for you is in the city of West Hollywood, California. They approved amendments to their municipal code, which regulates cannabis land uses. In April of 18, the city allowed for 8 consumption areas, which include smoking, vaping, and ingestion, with on-site adult use retail, and 8 consumption areas with edible ingestion only, with on-site adult use retail. To date, they have not issued any of those licenses, though. The state of Alaska, as I mentioned earlier, has drafted regulations which will allow marijuana retailers in freestanding locations to be licensed to sell adults up to 1 gram for on-site consumption. Products containing up to 10 milligrams of THC could also be made available for on-site consumption, although concentrates would be prohibited. One issue that was certainly a theme that was identified throughout this research was that additional revenue streams, especially in locations that folks had to bring their own product, additional revenue streams such as food or non-alcoholic beverages or live entertainment options would be worthy of consideration. This is based largely on Denver's experience, as it may increase the likelihood of a sustainable model for social consumption. Another issue that came up across the country was the issue of zoning and where these establishments could in fact be located. As I mentioned, the city of Denver, they've issued one, which is the coffee joint under 2016 ordinance that allows for social consumption, and a second entity is moving through their regulatory process, which may open later this fall. But as of August 2018, the coffee joint saw approximately 3,200 users of the consumption area in a 5-month period. But there's a lot of location and proximity restrictions for consumption areas that have limited all but 20 square miles of Denver, according to the city estimate for the potential location. A 1,000-foot buffer zone prohibits businesses from opening marijuana consumption areas near protected places, which again include schools, licensed child care centers, alcohol and drug treatment centers, city-owned pools, and recreation centers. Again, this is also something that the task force is exploring. The city of Los Angeles has a pretty strict local zoning compliance element that cannabis businesses are crowded into very small sections of the municipality, often in areas that are vulnerable or have low-income populations. A study of medical marijuana dispensaries in Los Angeles found that dispensaries were primarily commercially zoned in areas with greater road access, density of on and off-premise alcohol outlets, and with a high percentage of Hispanic residents. Real estate is certainly one of the primary hurdles for any small business, and businesses owned by people from marginalized communities. And so this is again an experience that we wanted to call the Commission's attention to. Again, I referenced Denver, where the zoning laws seem to have stifled potential social consumption licenses, as something that would warrant some close review from the Commission standpoint. And it also locating social consumption in areas that are walkable or accessible to public transit or other public transportation opportunities may avoid some of the issues of density in particular neighborhoods that California is experiencing. And lastly, an issue that is worthy of consideration is the issue of indoor smoking and combustion. Again, in Denver, marijuana consumption is limited to electronic vaping and edibles. Indoor smoking in dispensaries in California, they're required to install heating, ventilation, and air conditioning systems to prevent odor from leaking outside. Alaska's draft regulations require ventilation that can remove visible smoke. Massachusetts has, of course, the indoor smoking in public places is not permitted. However, DOR is licensed or authorized to license smoking bars, which has a very specific definition. And the Commission may recall that just this year, the governor signed an act protecting youth from the health risks of tobacco and nicotine addiction. That law broadens existing prohibitions on smoking, public smoking, to include e-cigarettes. While the concept of smoking bars would not be new in Massachusetts, marijuana does not currently fit within the legal definition. Therefore, social consumption may be limited to ingestion via electronic vaping and edibles. I know I mentioned lastly, just touching on the issues of public safety and welfare. As I mentioned at the outset as well, the cannabis policy is certainly analogous to that of tobacco and alcohol policies, specifically when referencing public use and social consumption. The research examining outcomes in states with medical and or adult use laws remains mixed and rather unstudied, although due to the heterogeneity inherent in cannabis policies, the design and nations of their laws, it's important that we consider researching anything that the Commission may consider as far as social consumption, and we develop a good baseline mechanisms to research this continually. And finally, just to wrap up, is the issue of social disparities that come along with the ability for folks to consume in safe places. Is logical that projecting the legalization overall without legalizing public consumption spaces may continue to disproportionately affect certain cohorts, such as persons of color or those unable to afford housing. It's just something that has certainly come up across the different jurisdictions as being a motivation in some cases for allowing social consumption. So again, in closing, this was certainly an effort on the staff's part to pull together as much research as possible and serve as a good guidepost for any discussions that the Commission may have. We are certainly ready, willing, and able to support the Commission in exploring any other areas of research that might be required, and certainly willing to work alongside you in your deliberations to develop any regulations that may stem from this conversation. And I guess that's it. I'm happy to take any questions you may have.
Thank you, Mr. Executive Director, and thank you to the staff for your good work on this. I'd like to start by asking if the commissioners have any questions for Sean or for members of the staff that were involved in the work. Commissioner Doyle?
I have a long list of questions
I
have a
if-
short list of questions.
So
All right.
let's start with Commissioner Flanagan then.
Well, first I want to thank the staff for the work that they've done. I know that this is a big issue. We've been a little bit busy in the past year, so I appreciate all the different departments coming together to get this done. I do want to talk about one concern I have, and that is the effect that the new smoking law is going to have on social consumption. I think that, in Massachusetts, we're very good at going along in our own different silos, and sometimes we have to intersect at a certain point. And I think while the debate was going on up on Beacon Hill with regards to an act protecting youth from the health risk of tobacco and nicotine addiction, we were still working in our own little direction. And so at some point, I think we're gonna have to take a look at that law and see exactly what the ramifications are and what we need to look at going forward. Not to say for or against social consumption, it's just to say that we need to be realistic about what's in front of us legally here. And I did have one question about Denver. When they said that they had the zoning, the one thing I would like to look into, and I probably could have done it before today, was did they zone to a point that there's a lot of public transportation? I mean, I'm just curious as to see if people are in the coffee joint or wherever else they are going to license public transportation that's available to the consumers. For me, public safety is an important piece of this. Living 50 miles from here, we don't have the benefit of trolleys and trains and subways and all that, buses and all that kind of stuff. So I still get very concerned when we start to talk about that. And the other piece of this is certainly public health. I appreciate the work that we're doing surrounding that. Obviously, I want to lessen the diversion that we have to youngsters, and I think that working with business owners, that we can take a look at that, but just to keep that in the back of our minds. And I'm also interested to see what the working group on smoking is doing. So it would be my hope that we could continue to study this, and that we could take some time to make sure that we have all our ducks in a row and that we're doing this the right way for the people of Massachusetts.
Anything else?
No.
Thank you. And you want to go with your long list, Commissioner Doyle? Or go ahead. We're gonna have to do it sooner or later, so let's do it.
Sorry. Apologies, had to turn the mic on. Back in December and possibly March, we discussed what we called Bring Your Own Cannabis lounges. And it sounds like around different jurisdictions, whether or not it's strictly a Bring Your Own Cannabis lounge or not, something similar to what we discussed back in December is being done in other jurisdictions. And what I'm interested in with regard to those kind of lounges is what security measures are taken to ensure what is in the product that is being brought to the environment, especially if it's being smoked, because it's then potentially having side products going into the atmosphere. I don't know if that's the right terminology, but I'm sure my more scientifically minded colleagues will correct me at some point. And then also, are there any rules in these establishments regarding sharing what you bring to the lounge? Because for issues of social equity, there is a lot of things that are potentially desirable about Bring Your Own Cannabis lounges, but not if it can't be done in a way that is safe. And so that balancing those issues is my primary concern with regard to those particular lounges, with a sort of strange side effect thought that where we're talking about, at least in my mind, the most compelling argument for BYOC is the inability of people to consume marijuana in the way they desire in their housing, because it's shared, because it's federally owned or state owned. But then, and there's real economic issues to that. And what occurred to me is when you go to an alcohol bar, you are typically paying a significant markup when you're buying something there. So if we were ultimately unpersuaded that it's sufficient safety measures can be implemented in bring your own cannabis lounges to protect the patrons from potentially each other or what is in the products that are being brought there. Are there price controls that could be introduced to the kind of social consumption operations that are linked to marijuana, to products that have to be bought on site? So if we weren't to allow BYOC, and we are to limit it at least at the outset to somewhere where you have to buy on site, are there price controls that we can put in to make sure that there is not the same sort of markup we see in alcohol establishments? Now, we may discover that that is not an economically viable proposition, and there are reasons for those markups, but I would at least like to explore that issue to see if we can balance those concerns.
Forgive me if I'm incorrect, but when we, in our draft regulations, approved a category for social consumption, we explicitly said no to BYOC, is that correct?
We did.
Okay.
The first round of discussion on this, but I think now that we're
Yeah,
real.
no, I just wanted, yeah, no, I agree with you, thank you. Keep going.
I thought you were gonna jump all over me for suggesting price controls.
I'm gonna wait my turn, but yes, I will.
Yeah. I figured that would be against your general philosophy, but
You don't go to the Business School University of Chicago and end up agreeing with price controls on anything.
I know. And I shouldn't introduce the subject without clarifying that it's not an independent thought on my part. It has been done with regard to tobacco regulation in other jurisdictions. So I can't claim credit for the idea. So, sorry, there's more. So one of the things that I wanted to actually just repeat that Commissioner Flanagan said is I am myself concerned about how the 2018 Smoking Act intersects with marijuana and specifically 94G Section 13. So I would appreciate any insight into how that would work. This may be the province of the smoking work group, but I would really like to understand better the difference on the relative dangers between secondhand smoke, tobacco versus cannabis, and secondhand vapor, because we're hearing a lot about the danger of e-cigarettes lately, and how the dangers between tobacco, smoke, vapor compare between cannabis vapor, cannabis tobacco, smoke. From everything I've read, it does appear that vapor is better than smoking, but certainly not without its own risks. So it would be nice to have a clearer understanding of what the relative risks are, especially when we're talking about employees of these establishments being exposed to them, and how can we protect them in a comprehensive way. We haven't explicitly talked about this yet, but one of the things we discussed in December was the idea of cannabis restaurants, cannabis cafes, where products are consumed, no, not mixed use,
Okay.
sorry, where products are prepared on site to be consumed, more like a restaurant than a bar. So you would have potentially a cannabis dinner. And how those products are tested, including for correct dosage, if it's being done in other jurisdictions, someone must have looked at this so that we can get an idea of what they have done and how successful they think it has been. Another thing that we talked about earlier was limited day licensing for events such as weddings, and what regulations are in place in those other jurisdictions to prevent diversions to minors, and how successful they feel that they've been. And I think the other questions that I have been covered, except, and I apologize if I missed this, but do we anticipate getting recommendations from the OUI Commission and the Cannabis Advisory Board on social consumption, and when are those recommendations going to come?
Go ahead, answer that, please.
Sure.
Ken?
And I'll do my best to answer some of the other questions as well. So the Special Commission on Operating Under the Influence and Impaired Driving is actively meeting. In fact, there's a meeting scheduled for Friday of this week, which will be the fourth or fifth meeting of that group. The deadline to report to the legislature is the end of the calendar year, and we are certainly, as the chairman of that commission, we're certainly on track to do that and committed to doing that. It's a 13-member group which meets as frequently as is necessary and is currently getting presentations from a lot of folks. There hasn't been a lot of discussion yet on compiling recommendations, but I certainly think we're headed toward that, down that path. The advisory board met in September, and the subcommittees were each asked to come back, each of the subcommittees that exist, were each asked to explore the issues of social consumption and home delivery, and are expected, the advisory board, I believe, is meeting the first week of November as well, and hoping to reconvene and compile all of those different subcommittees, their work and their discussions, and come back to the commission with some recommendations. Or certainly come back and say we need more time as well. I guess I don't want to forecast yet what they may come back with, but that was the last discussion item of the advisory board, was to reconvene in early November and compile those. So actively meeting.
Great.
You had a question as well about kind of the bring your own cannabis, or the folks that it's a site but not necessarily a licensed establishment. I think California is an example that might be a balance there, which is it's tied to an existing retailer, and obviously I think any limitations that retailer may put on the purchase, so you need to purchase the product from that retailer. So from a testing standpoint, that may be one model. Denver is bring your own, and I certainly will dig into both the zoning question as well as the source of product, or if there's any rules around that, to see if there's any limitations or protection that could be put in place there if necessary, or if that issue has been explored at all in any particular depth. As far as price controls, I'm curious to see what the chairman thinks about that as well. But I think it could be also on both ends as well. In alcohol, there's a price control on the bottom end that you can't have a loss leader in a product, so as to undercut the market as well. So I think price controls on both ends are certainly discussion items. And then I certainly think the dangers of secondhand smoke is ripe for the working group's purview and review, and we'll certainly introduce that concept early in their deliberation.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, I think there's some things that can't be addressed right, like the 2018 law, but I think you covered the things that you could. Thanks. Commissioner McBride, Commissioner Title, who would like to go next? Go ahead, Commissioner McBride.
So I think the point is well taken about providing a venue for individuals who are otherwise unable to consume, in their residence, in particular. My question really is about, we've talked about social consumption in terms of equity. And one of the things that I've heard a few times is that there's a lower barrier to entry, potentially, if we're talking about these types of licenses along with delivery as maybe having a lower barrier to entry. Could we talk a little bit about really what the costs are that are associated with these types of establishments, and what we're talking about when we talk about a lower barrier to entry? Because anyone who has sort of talked to people who operate in the entertainment business, entertainment venues, or certainly restaurants, those margins are pretty thin, and it's pretty costly to operate just a straight up restaurant, never mind one that's going to have potentially other requirements put on it. Certainly if we move ahead with something where there was smoking and we're talking about ventilation systems and the like, or we're talking about other possible requirements. I guess I'd like to have a better sense of if we are saying that there's a lower barrier to entry here, in what types of establishments are we talking about there being a lower barrier to entry? How much lower is that barrier? What are we presuming if we say that there is a lower barrier to entry? What are we kind of presuming that isn't happening or that is happening to allow for those types of venues to operate? So that's my first question, is really kind of getting a sense of the costs there. My other questions really have to do with public safety. So in other jurisdictions that are moving ahead with social consumption, what are those jurisdictions doing with regard to preparing for impaired driving? And that already exists. I mean, I think that, you know, this is nothing new, right? We know that operating under the influence already exists in other contexts, certainly. But is there an ongoing dialogue in those jurisdictions about what, if anything, is being done to prepare, given that this is a very different, it's different. It's not like alcohol impairment. And what are those jurisdictions anticipating, and how are they moving ahead with making sure that we are, you know, there's a balance struck between public safety and providing for social consumption. And then, I guess similar to that, in those jurisdictions, what are licensees required to do with regard to preventing patrons from operating while impaired? And maybe even more importantly, other than what they're required to do, what are they doing voluntarily? And what is the industry and the operators in those jurisdictions doing to ensure that the general public safety is being taken care of? And I think that that's something where, you know, we have a conversation a lot, and there seems to be that, you know, people sort of go into their corners that, you know, you're either pro-public safety or you're pro-social consumption. And I think that, you know, that really is something where it doesn't matter where you are on the issue of social consumption, everyone needs to be pro-public safety on this, because it's going to be affecting everybody, and that goes, you know, social consumption and also just generally for any kind of consumption. So I'd sort of like to have a better understanding of what's going on in those jurisdictions, and how it dovetails certainly with the work of the commission, I think is a question as well. So I will certainly support Commissioner Doyle and her request for information on that.
Anything else? Commissioner Title?
First of all, this report is really good. I think when you look at like most of the information that has come from government agencies in general on like controversial subjects around marijuana, you expect to see a lot of lies, or you expect to see like just the least you could possibly say. And this report, it's so clear that it's exhaustive and so much work went into it. So I want to compliment the legal department, the constituent services department, the research department, anyone else who worked on it. You can tell that the research was totally exhaustive, and then there were a lot of choices made as to how to present it in a way that's clear and organized. That was so helpful. So thank you. And I think that it's exactly the tone we want to strike. It's so informed and appropriately cautious. And I think by us having this report in advance and knowing that we could trust the information in it, that it's elevating the dialogue that we're about to have. So thank you for that. I have only one question on the last page. So in the social disparities and then closing, it concludes that the commission has committed to addressing the list of issues, smoking and various operational requirements and impaired operation. I would suggest that before this goes out to the public, that you add that the commission has also committed to initially offering these types of licenses to small businesses and to equity program participants. I think that's a very key part of the policy that we're trying to design here, and we don't want to omit that as people read through this report and try and understand what's coming next. And then finally, as a point of clarification, I believe that back in December we did foresee that the smoking laws were also changing at the same time, and so the smoking working group is explicitly tasked with investigating that question.
Thank you. Anything else?
Nope.
Okay. Thanks. I think most of the questions that I had have already been asked, but one thing that did not come up, and I thought Kay was getting there, or Commissioner Doyle was getting there, but she kind of took a little sideways jig on me. You didn't say anything with respect to mixed-use licenses when you were talking about other states. Is there any evidence or any data with respect to mixed-use social consumption licenses in other states?
not as a licensed or permissive activity. I certainly know that it's happening in other jurisdictions,
Okay.
but as well as it being a kind of sanctioned licensed. So I know in the past it's been referenced as far as restaurants or yoga studios, movie theaters. It's not a licensed activity. That said, I think to your point, Commissioner Doyle's point, it's something that the commission certainly considered and as a
Right.
concept, but it's hard to find any sort of specific analogous references to it that from a licensed standpoint.
Okay, thanks. And then next question I have on the BYOC issue. We did discuss this back in, I guess it was December, sometime before March, when we did agree to authorize social consumption in our draft regulations. We said only for things that were sold on premises, no BYOC. I'm curious, since most of the examples you gave us, Mr. Executive Director, did allow for BYOC and not for sold on premises, if you got any sense of the logic behind that? Because one of the things you did mention in your overview is that if you're not selling, the economics of operating one of these lounges is a little bit suspect, unless you're allowed to sell beer or wine, which I guess one place is doing. But I'm just wondering if you got any sense of the thinking behind BYOC in the states that have authorized that.
Specifically, or any one example would be difficult to ascertain. I think what adds to the complexity of this is, whether it be California or Denver as an example, is they're largely municipal driven, so the rationale could be different in each jurisdiction, but it's certainly a theme that I think we've gathered today that will kind of specifically dial into both the rationale, but also to Commissioner McBride's point, asking what is required of those operators from an awareness standpoint or materials, or as far as the rationale for bringing your own cannabis and kind of the justification. I think one is it needs to be sourced from somewhere, and if it's not tied to an existing, whether it be statewide or locally issued retail license, then it needs to be sourced from somewhere. But then also what requirements are on those specific operators as far as informing or making the public or their consumers aware, but also what they might be doing voluntarily, and see if there's even like a best practice that has developed over time. And certainly that's something we'll undertake as well.
And I guess the last point, since everybody seems to be so interested in my opinion about price controls, I see no reason for them. I believe that if we do go forward with social consumption, that the market will determine what an appropriate market is, and I don't think that we want to be in the position of understanding or trying to understand the economics of each operation and how much of a margin they need to sustain their business. I really do believe that competition will get us to a point where we do have the right prices. Now that is somewhat of a religious statement on my part, but I feel pretty strongly. But I'm certainly happy to get into this topic if and when we decide how to go forward. And it's a very different conversation and that's what BYOB versus or BYOC versus sold on premises is pretty critical, because that changes completely the economics of operating one of these facilities. So I think, other than showing what my religion is, I think it's premature to have a conversation about it. But I think at the appropriate point, if we do go forward, we should and will have that conversation. My belief, although I'd like to hear from my fellow commissioners, my belief is that we have a list of questions that require further research. I know that everybody has been taking notes. My recommendation, but I'd like to hear from my fellow commissioners, is that at our next meeting on the 14th, the executive director comes back with a compiled list of questions that represents the questions that came up today, and a timeline for addressing those, so that we can be consistent with the commitments we've made previously in terms of our commitment to decide. And if we do decide to go forward with creating final regulations on this, I'd like to see both the list of questions and the timeline, if that's something that the executive director is comfortable with. But before we can ask for other suggestions about how to proceed. So again, conversation kind of stops right now today. Next week, or next meeting, which is I guess next week, the 14th, the 18th, we get the executive director to come back with a compiled list of all the questions that he's heard today, and a timeline for addressing them, so that we can set up subsequent commission meetings to discuss, debate, and decide how to go forward. Is that?
Mr. Chairman, my personal opinion is that I would rather get this right than keep putting out timelines that if we said that we would take it up again in November, it gives them enough leeway to come to do the research and the questions? I mean, we just don't know how much is gonna be entailed in this, and we're still trying to license at the same time, and
We're asking the executive director to come back and say, here's a list of questions and here's a timeline that I can commit to. So we're not imposing a timeline, we're not telling them to rush, we're saying, here are the questions, when do you believe that, the staff can do the appropriate work? I really strongly prefer to do that than leave it open-ended, but we're not imposing a timeline as much as asking the executive director to suggest what he's comfortable with. Is that okay?
I've said my piece.
Commissioner
I-
Tyler?
Go ahead. No, go ahead.
Commissioner McBride? Somebody's got to
So,
speak.
all right, so, can someone read, if they have it in front of them, what the motion was that we adopted when we did this on February 26th or 22nd, whatever the was? Because we've already put into place, one timeline, right?
That's correct, yeah.
So, before we kind of have competing or,
Yeah, mine was a timeline for the research, not for the actual
right,
process.
so I guess I just wanna kind of work backwards from
Yeah,
sort of
no, I think that-
what we decided at the outset, and then let's work
That makes
backwards
perfect
and
sense.
then work forwards, right?
Do you have that, General Counsel?
I have the language on the delay of, the vote to delay social consumption and delivery. But I don't think that I have the language on the action plan specifically.
Could we take could we recess for like 2 minutes, just so that we can kind of pull up the minutes from that meeting and can look at them?
I have 2 minutes worth of comments, so I can make them well.
Okay, go ahead, Commissioner Tyler.
All right, so, yeah, I'm not ready for the conversation to stop just yet, because I wanted to say a couple of things. So, yeah, I agree, I don't think there's any need for a vote today. My recommendation is somewhat similar. I don't think that the list of questions that we gave today, based on my experience talking to Alaska and Maine and Denver regulators, is that there are answers to those questions. I think that what has been put into law and regulations is basically in this report. We can certainly reach out to them and try and understand the decision-making process and if there's drafts in place. And I do expect that we should. But we shouldn't expect that there are answers. I think they're looking to us as much as we're looking to
I agree with that.
I think that using this report as the initial basis, that we consider partnering with those cities and towns that are thinking about opting in. To Commissioner Flanagan's earlier point, it's not helpful when we're in our own silos, not paying attention. And I think one thing we learned from the past 6 months during this delay is that it makes more sense for us to work collaboratively with the cities and towns, and I can see why it's the first sentence of this report that that's largely the approach that other states have taken. So without implementing a program just yet, I would suggest that we partner with those cities and towns who do wish to opt in and form a working group where we can dig in with 3 goals. 1, create a business model that's designed for small businesses and equity program participants. And then 2, address the public safety and public health concerns, which I think at this point have been pretty clearly fleshed out. And then do so collaboratively, and then come back to the group with a suggestion for a type of pilot program. So that would be my suggestion for the executive director. Maybe we can all discuss our recommendations. However, I also wanted to note for those of you that are recapping this discussion for the public that it's important. There are 2 reality checks that I think the 5 of us know, but not necessarily the public. One is that this is not going to happen immediately because there is no workable process currently under the law by which a city or town can allow this, and that needs to happen before a facility can open. So I would say it's a matter of years, and right now there is no, there would need to be a change in the legislation before cities and towns can move forward. So just we're all on the same page about that. I saw some calls from activists over the weekend that were trying to blame Governor Baker. So I wanted to say right now it's not Governor Baker's fault. Actually, last year in Governor Baker's supplemental budget, there was a fix that would have addressed the error in the law, and that did not end up being passed by the legislature. So I'm happy to answer more questions about that afterward, but not Governor Baker's fault, and the law does not have a process right now for cities or towns to pass social consumption, so they are not going to open tomorrow. The second reality check that I think people should understand is that there will be social consumption eventually. 20% of the public uses marijuana. They have ways that they use it. This is not some new scary group of people that's going to start doing some new scary thing. This morning I checked my email and I had an event listing for what was going on in Massachusetts today. And one was our meeting, and the second listing on there was Ganja Yoga, and it said exactly where it was and what the event was. Like, this is something that's happening. There are what was referred to in a newspaper about a bus last week, marijuana parties, where people will go to an event, they will share with each other what they're allowed to do under the law, and there's no clear rules on what you can charge for, you know, what's legal, what's illegal, and this is happening, but it's operating in a space where you could be busted any day and you don't really know what the rules are. There are huge events happening that are centered around marijuana and marijuana consumers. Commissioner Flanagan and I had a meeting with a very well-respected event venue and city officials in that city that were interested in approaching this. How could they have on-site consumption at such an event in a way that was safe and fair, so that you don't have what you have now, where you have to hide at home like a criminal, or smoke in your car, or walk outside and smoke. So let's just operate from a place of reality. In 10 years, this is going to be as normal as when you go to the Boston Common and see a movie and you can buy a drink. But it's not happening tomorrow. So that's why I think we should have a pilot program that starts slow, uses this type of research that is clear and fact-based, and then make our decisions moving forward where we can implement the vision that we already passed, where this would be a program for small businesses and equity program participants. So for example, if you want to do, I hate to use yoga again because it's become so cliche, but if you have a massage studio and you want to use an infused oil, do you need $1 million security system? Do you need $1 million HVAC system? I think that if we have a pilot program, and our vision from the beginning is to make this truly affordable and accessible, it'll take some time, but I think we can get there.
Okay, thanks. Do you have an answer to Mr. Executive Director? Thanks.
I believe I may have several answers.
Well, I think I'm specifically asking about the question that Commissioner McBride asked.
Right, so as far as the motion itself back in March, the reference to so is that the context of delaying the social consumption delivery?
No, actually, I found the point in the minutes that I think, and I'm happy to. Okay,
Would you read that, please?
Yep, so this is from February 26th. And I'll read it verbatim from the minutes. Commissioner Taylor reread the proposed motion as eliminating social consumption and delivery from the proposed regulations, limiting social consumption licenses to equity applicants and craft cooperatives, and delivery licenses to equity applicants, micro businesses, and craft cooperatives for an unspecified period of time, coming back within 2 weeks to discuss an action plan. Chairman Hoffman asked for an explicit time frame on the draft regulations. Commissioner Title said her recommendation would be to collect information by October 2018 and to draft regulations by February 2019. And that was what, that's what we voted on and what was approved. So we currently have a marker in there to have a draft of regulations by February of 2019, right, without that would take the normal course of any regulatory process,
right,
but with the idea being, having something together by February of 2019. Mm-hmm. So if we have that up there as a marker, what are the intervening steps?
Yeah, so that's consistent certainly with my recollection and consistent with what I was recommending, which is that we ask the Executive Director to come back at our next meeting with a set of actions and questions that the staff will dive into, consistent with the time frame that you just talked about, and without imposing a timeline on him, for the staff to ask him to come back with a timeline that is consistent with the February timeline that you just articulated. So I think what you just said is totally consistent with what I was asking for. I'm not ignoring your suggestion, I'm just saying from my suggestion, it's totally consistent with that timeline. Other comments?
Yeah, I mean, my fear is that, I mean, if we have broad timelines, I'm fine with that. I just don't wanna start saying, okay, at the October 18th meeting, we're gonna have such and such, because again, we're trying to license, we're trying to get this process going at the same time. Certainly people have expressed their concern that it's not happening fast enough. If we keep adding work on top of that to the staff, it's not gonna all get done. So my goal is just as the chairman said, I wanna get it done, I just wanna make sure there are broad timelines that the staff can work under and be realistic about it.
Well, and that's what I would like to ask the
Yeah.
executive director to do. And I think that giving him 10 days between now and when he'd come back with that report, just to say, here are the questions and here's the timeline, I think that should be sufficient time. Is that correct, Mr. Executive Director?
That's what the commission wants, that's what we'll do.
So that's one option on the table. Like, any comments on Commissioner Tuttle's suggestion?
So I wanted to just ask a couple of clarifying questions. So with regard to the pilot program, can you just, I guess, kind of restate or just reiterate what you were thinking of for that in terms of a time frame?
So I don't think it's actually necessary for us to draft regulations by February at this point, given that there is no local way to move forward. So I would actually suggest instead that we have our communications and government relations team put out a call in the same way we did with the municipal survey for people in leadership roles who are interested in being on this working group to opt in to work with us. I think ideally the number would be 5 to 10, but let's see what we get back. And then convene that group and then discuss the timeline for a pilot program. Basically, until there's no legal way forward, I don't see a reason why we need to have a specific timeline.
So the idea would be to collaborate with municipalities that might have an interest in it and to sort of have kind of a working group on what that would look like and what the, I guess, the pieces would be that would come together to establish that. It would be with the idea being that it would be municipalities that have an interest, but with the idea that at some point in time there would be a license that would be issued by our commission. Is that correct?
That's my suggestion, yes. And certainly I'm not trying to delay anything by not implementing a timeline. It's just I don't think it's necessary. So just to clarify, so I know there are at least 3 or 4 city officials that are interested in having this discussion because we talked about an opt-in group earlier in an earlier discussion. But if we work collaboratively to discuss what the bullet points of a pilot program might look like, addressing both equity and the public health and safety concerns at both the state and local level, then the group would report back to the commission, and then we could deliberate on their recommendations and form regulations appropriately.
So this group would it would encompass maybe mayors, boards of selectmen, public health officials, potentially municipal attorneys, other public safety officials.
I would think zoning and planning.
Okay, just to kind of provide the executive director and staff with, ideas on how we want this to come together if we were to move forward with that.
Given that this is purely a discussion-based group and recommendation-making group, I don't think that we should put out the idea that there would need to be like a vote at the local level or anything official. I think if you're in a leadership capacity, correct me if you disagree, but if you're in a leadership capacity or leadership role at the municipal level and you simply want to be part of this group to discuss it, that you should be able to be part of the group.
Can I invoke my non-lawyer excuse for a change, which is I'd really like to understand what your point, and I'd like the General Counsel's opinion on as well, about why this is infeasible right now. Why cities and towns cannot go forward right now. So, General Counsel, do you have an opinion on that topic?
I would be hesitant to express an opinion without thinking that through a
Okay.
little bit more.
Can I at least
I mean,
understand
I think-
can I understand the issue at least?
May I make a suggestion?
Sure.
Which is, since there are a number of questions that the commissioners asked, along with a proposal to form a working group,
Right.
would it make sense to task the executive director and myself with looking into whether it makes a separate working group makes sense and how that should be constituted?
I also would like to understand, you know, we made a commitment, and Commissioner McBride, not a commitment, but we set an expectation that Commissioner McBride just reminded all of us about, that we reconvene in October, as we're doing right now, discuss this issue with the intention, if we were to go forward, to have regulations in place, or at least to start the regulatory process in
Well,
in
I don't think-
February.
to be clear, I think it wasn't to start the regulatory process, it was to have a document.
a draft,
that we- Right,
right.
but it wasn't, but
No,
then
fair
we
enough.
know.
That's
right, we
better
didn't make any
language.
commitment to start the regulatory process, it was to kind of have something together.
And thank you. My recollection, back to that discussion, is we didn't say, well, it was going to take years to implement. We didn't say that there was an obstacle or set of obstacles that made this unable to be implemented if we chose to go forward. So I'm just a little bit myself confused that there seems to be a new element to this conversation.
It's actually not new. There is some just technical issues with the existing legislation that need to be fixed. Governor Baker, to his credit, tried to work with, I think, the Secretary of State's office to provide a little clarity into that process. I don't think got reached in the past legislative session. I don't think that's anything other than it didn't get reached. It may get introduced again, but at this point in time, it just hasn't been fixed yet. And so I think, you know, everybody in good faith, I'm sure, will look at the issue again because they know we're talking about it, and we'll see what happens. But it does probably need to get fixed, and I'm no elections expert by any means, but I think it probably does need to get fixed before whatever we authorize can happen at the local level, because municipalities do need a clear process by which they can opt in.
Okay, I'm not sure that there can't be, go ahead.
And I think to add to that, you know, using the words obstacle, delay, whatever people want to use, is that this smoking act that was passed could have an effect on indoor smoking. It could have an effect on anything. So we have to look at what's in front of us, which is very different than when we discussed this back in February, so that we do get it right. And I think to Commissioner Title's credit, you know, working groups, commissions, task force, they provide some input, and I think that there's a benefit to that. I would like to work with Commissioner Title or with legal to sort of hone in on who could be part of that. Certainly, I would like to see people from the planning department or the zoning department or the public health department or the board of health, and not just town administrators or selectmen or mayors, to have their input, because, you know, as I've traveled around the state over the last year, and I also would like to have people from different parts of the state, because I think that, you know, when you go to the central part of the state, it's different than the eastern, and the western certainly has their challenges. We want all that input so that this can get done. Because certainly when Commissioner Dole and I were in Lenox, the concerns they had were very different than the constituents in Boston. And so we want to be able to work through that. And I just think it adds another layer of input from the citizen, and it allows us to have a different course of thinking from the municipality level, which we may not have. And given that we cannot constantly rely on Commissioner Doyle, because we can't talk without cameras in front of us, it's beneficial to have that conversation.
Yeah, I guess I don't see any reason that we can't proceed kind of on parallel paths here, which is to, one, as I suggested, ask the executive director to come back in 2 weeks and say, here are the questions that the commission asked of me, and here is a timeline for coming back with responses. Simultaneously, asking the executive director with input from Commissioner Title, Commissioner Flanagan, the general counsel, on how we might constitute this working group. And I think we can move forward on both fronts simultaneously. I understand the implementation constraint that Commissioner Doyle and Commissioner Title refer to. I think that should not stop us from doing the work that we need to do, so that we're in good stead in terms of how we want to proceed. So I would recommend both asking staff to do some additional research, as well as to work on outlining how a working group would be constituted, and frankly, how we get it started as quickly as possible. Is that acceptable to everybody? Any issues with that? Then, Mr. Executive Director, if I could ask, that would be what we'd expect to hear back from you on the 18th.
I would like to just make one
Please.
request that certainly when you're putting together the working group, I would like for there to be, and I think someone already mentioned this, but
Pardon?
I would like for there to be law enforcement representation certainly included on the working group as well, please.
Commissioner Town?
Just to reiterate the idea for the working group, this is for those that intend to opt in. And so I think that as far as we can keep the bureaucracy like minimal, I don't want it to be a case where, someone wants to opt in and be part of the working group just to discuss it, and then it becomes a whole, like, we have to get everybody's input on whether we should be in this working group or not. Like, it's just making recommendations. So just keeping that in mind as a philosophy.
So you'll come back with a proposal consistent with Commissioner Child's suggestion?
Yes.
And all the other comments, obviously, that were made about the working group. Thanks. Are there any other comments, Commissioner Flanagan?
I'd just like to add one other thing, again, as people listen to us talk about social consumption and all the policy considerations that we have to have, people are able to weigh in on this. There's various methods on our website that you can get in touch with commissioners. So this is not just a commission deliberation. We've obviously asked for input before from the people of Massachusetts. We're looking to do that again. And I think that's important. I have been to California. I have spoken to the people in leadership there. The one concern is that there's been multiple emergency regulations and things have changed, and that's hurtful to businesses and to consumers because they don't understand what's going on and what's the process. And granted, they have a different method of working. They have a different system than we do. I think we've been really good in trying to make sure that people know what we're doing going forward. Having said that, I think we do need to have fact-based conversations. I do think that we need to consider what's in front of us and how those implications are going to last 30 days, 60 days, 3 years, 10 years from now. The truth is, in 10 years, we all term out of these jobs. None of us will be sitting here. Once the chairman terms out in 10 years, then that's it. But having said that, and to Commissioner Title's point, that these things are going on. These things are still going on, and we keep talking about sort of the illegal market versus the legal market, and we want to be cognizant of the fact that we are trying to build a legal market here in Massachusetts. And I think that some of the conversations become very difficult, especially when we take a look at imposing certain licenses so that small businesses can be a part of this. I have a concern that when it comes to dispensary lounges or smoking bars or whatever you want to call them, that there is a high barrier of cost. An HVAC system alone is going to cost people a lot of money, and so short of mixed use, I'm not sure that social equity applicants or economic empowerment applicants are going to be able to afford this. And I don't want to set up expectations so people expect things from us and then we don't reach that. And so I'm hoping that people have very honest comments for us and that they share them with us, especially if you know part of the businesses that we don't. I've been in government for 22 years. I've never run a business. So it's helpful to hear from people who have and what that is. And so I think that as we do our due diligence, we ask the people of the Commonwealth to do the same thing and to sort of let us know what they know so that we can make informed decisions moving forward.
Thanks. I think it's pretty clear this is a complicated topic and an important topic, and I think we actually made some progress in this conversation today in terms of the path forward, so I'm grateful for that. I do think it's important, and I might be beating a dead horse here, but I think it's important that we are very explicit about what that path forward is and what the expectations are in terms of timeline. And if those timelines need to change, those expectations need to change, we'll publicly say so. But I do think it's important that we are very explicit about here's what's going to happen next and here's our expectation about time, just to set expectations, not just for the public, but for ourselves and for the staff as well. So I appreciate the effort over the next 8 days helping us set that timeline. But I thought we made some progress today. Commissioner McBride, it's like you're anxious to say something.
I can appreciate the desire to have a timeline, so I think that I agree that is important. I also just want to pay a compliment to Commissioner Title, because I think that the idea of putting together a working group to think about a pilot program that includes municipalities that have an interest in moving forward with this is really important, because I think that it provides perspectives that often we are making to Commissioner Flanagan's point, very general regulations, and I think that having folks who are at the local level be able to bring a voice to this and talk about what is needed in one municipality versus another municipality, or what the concerns might be, is really important. And so I really appreciate the suggestion. I think it's a very wise and well-intentioned, step forward. So I appreciate that.
Thank you. Unless there are other comments, I'm suggesting we move on to the next agenda item. Yeah, well, we got just two quick things. We're going to go a little bit out of order. So first of all, there are no topics for discussion that I was not aware of. There are topics that I was not aware of?
Yes, there's one. It's just a very minor.
I hate not being aware of topics, but go ahead
I'm
and
sorry,
enlighten me, Commissioner Doyle.
You won't care, trust me. It's nothing.
I will,
he cares.
I will be the judge of that.
It came to my attention recently that, especially with the new regulations out there for comment on the medical use of marijuana, that people are emailing me at my old Department of Public Health address.
You're right, I don't care.
I know. And I just want to remind everybody, in case you didn't know, because this is a little bit insider baseball, when you move state agencies, your email address changes. So please do not email me at the medical marijuana address you may remember from years ago. Please email the Cannabis Commission or email me at kay.doyle@mass.gov. Thank you.
Is there any reason or any surprise that I was unaware that that was an additional agenda item? That
I just found out.
Listen, not being able to take your name from one agency to the next is a big deal.
Do you have another agenda item that I was unaware of, Commissioner
I do.
Tuttle? This is really embarrassing.
This is very important. It's my son's 5th birthday.
All
And
right.
I'm gonna show him on the live stream. Hi Neil, happy 5th birthday.
Happy birthday, Neil. I wasn't aware of that as well. And that one I'm embarrassed about not being aware of. This one, I'm less embarrassed. Anyway, there are no other topics that I was unaware of when the agenda for this meeting was pulled together. Last thing, our next public commission meeting will be October 18, 2018. We are back at the Health Policy Commission on 50 Milk Street, although I did want to thank our host from the Mass Gaming Commission for the use of their room today. I would like to move at this point to enter executive session, not to return to open session, in order to discuss matters subject to the provisions of the Open Meeting Law, General Law, Chapter 30A, Section 21A6. These matters will include discussions about the lease of real property, specifically Satellite Office Project Number 201-845-00.1, and Headquarters Project Number 201-844-000.0. If the Commission were to have discussions in open session, it would have detrimental effect on its bargaining position to obtain these leases. Can I have a second for this motion, please?
Second.
All in favor?
Roll call.
No, the roll call in executive session. I thought we had to do roll call.
And to go in.
And to go in, okay, so Commissioner McBride?
Aye.
Commissioner Doyle?
Aye.
Commissioner Title?
Aye.
Commissioner Flanagan?
Aye.
Commissioner Hoffman? Aye. Thank you. We are now in executive session. We're going to actually leave ourselves, so you're welcome to stay in this room, although that we are not going to reconvene. But right now we are in executive session, and we will adjourn from executive session. Thank you.